Margaya Varajanmana Shaunaka Uvacha Mahim Pratishthamatyasya Saute Svayam Puvo Manahu Kandyan Vatushtadvarane Margaya Varajanmana. Would you like to chant? Anyone else? Mahim Pratishthamatyasya Saute Svayam Puvo Manu Kanyan Vashtadvarani Margaya Varajanmana. Okay, word for word. Shaunika Uvacha said, Mahim the earth, Pratishtham situated, Adyasya having secured, Saute O Sutta Goswami, Svayambhuvaha Manahu Manu Kani what Anvatishtat performed Dvarani ways Margaya to get out Avara later Janmanam of those to be born. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. Sri Shaunika inquired, "Oh, Sutta Goswami, after the earth was again situated in its orbit, what did Swayambhuvamana do to show the path of liberation to persons who were to take birth later on?" Please repeat. Sri Shaunika inquired, "O Sutta Goswami, after the earth was again situated in its orbit, what did Swayambhuvamanu do to show the path of liberation to persons who were to take birth later on?" And the purport. The appearance of the Lord as the first boar incarnation occurred during the time of Swayambhuva Manu, whereas the present age is in the period of Vaibhasvata Manu. Each Manu's period lasts 72 times the cycle of 4 ages, and one cycle of ages equals 4,320,000 solar years. Thus, 4,320,000 times 72 solar years is the reign of one Manu. In each Manu's period, there are many changes in many ways, and there are 14 Manus within one day of Brahma. It is understood here that Manu creates scriptural regulations for the salvation of the conditioned souls, who come to the material world for material enjoyment. The Lord is so kind that any soul who wants to enjoy in this material world is given full facility for enjoyment, and at the same time, he is shown the path of salvation. Shaunaka Rishi therefore inquired from Sutta Goswami, quote, what did Swayambhuva Manu do after the reinstatement of the earth in its orbital situation? Om Jnana Timirantasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshuraniritang Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, and my spiritual master opened my eyes with the torch lamp of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Anchakalpatarupyashcha kripa santubhya evacha patitana pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. I offer my respectful obeisances unto all of the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, who are just like desire trees that can fulfill the desires of everyone and are full of compassion for all the fallen conditioned souls. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, Shaunakavacha Mahim Pratishtamathyasya Sauti Swayambhuvo Manahu Kanyan Matrishtadvarani Margaya Vadajanmana. This is 320.1. Sri Shaunaka inquired, O Sutta Goswami, after the earth was again situated in its orbit, what did Swayambhuva Manu do to show the path of liberation to persons who were to take birth later on? Hare Krishna. So great to be with all of you again. So, we see here, there was a bit of a blip. There was a problem in the maintenance of the universe. The Earth planet was completely dislocated from its normal orbit, and it was a massive problem, actually. There were two extremely powerful and quite selfish and impious persons who were dictating terms to everyone else, and one was actually just slain by an incarnation of the Lord. So problems of all sizes appear and disappear in the material world. It's not just me, right? Show of hands, anybody else experienced problems occasionally, sometimes? Okay, I feel a little better. So it does happen. This is the nature of the material world. And the Bhagavatam is full of descriptions of people with problems, entire planets with problems, large-scale problems and very small problems. And that's because it's the nature of the material world and material consciousness. And according to the mode of nature one is situated in the material world, one's approach to this is different. In the mode of ignorance, the lowest mode, one doesn't even realize that they have a problem. And the problem is they don't realize they have a problem. Persons in that mode just distract themselves. They actually are very difficult. It's very difficult for the truth to penetrate their consciousness that there's actually something going on. And the Bhagavatam mentions this in one verse where it says, sarcastically actually, that there are only two kinds of persons that are experiencing bliss in the world. The completely self-realized, purely spiritual personality, and the utter fool. And of course, of the two, the utter fool isn't really experiencing bliss. They're experiencing the ignorance is bliss principle. But ignorance isn't bliss. As the saying goes, the only thing more expensive than a good education is ignorance. So in the lowest mode, one is simply getting beaten. They're just getting beaten by circumstance, and they don't even realize what's happening. And higher than that is the mode of passion, where one tries to solve their problems, but one ends up running from problem to problem. And that's the predominant mode, at best, in material consciousness in today's modern world. And it's this kind of putting out the fire consciousness. If I just do this, then I'll be happy. If I could just, deal with my lower back issues, I'll be happy. If I could just get a good wife or husband, money, go to Hawaii. We're in Hawaii. Are there people with problems in Hawaii? Or is it just everywhere else? It's definitely also here. It doesn't just go away when you enter the precincts of Hawaii, which is a beautiful place, I'll admit. It's wonderful. I was going on a japa walk, bird song everywhere, flowers, and still existential problems are there. And so this is a major distinction between material consciousness, modern consciousness, and the spiritual culture of the Srimad Bhagavatam. There was a massive problem. There was a terrorist, the likes of which we can't even imagine in our scale, who was abusing and exploiting everybody, and the entire planet was actually affected by it. Geographically, like it was actually dislocated by it. And that problem was solved by the Lord himself. So now, Shaunika, who's hearing this conversation, he's inquiring from Sutta Goswami, okay, so then what happened? What happened so that the path of liberation could be shown to persons, not just at the time, but later? You know, there's so many people yet to come. This is the vision of spiritually minded persons. Okay, yeah, so that problem was solved. But what happened about the real goal of life? How did that goal of life get demonstrated? How did the path of spiritual advancement get demonstrated and exemplified for persons who are trying to get out of this world of problems? Material consciousness is, if I just deal with this problem, I'll be fine. You know, you come to office, and if I just put out the fires started by the last administration, it'll be great. All you have to do is look at 2 pictures of presidents, beginning of the term and the end of the term, how much they age in terms of their face. See the kind of strain they have to take in that kind of consciousness of putting out fires. There are unlimited fires in material life. The solution isn't to just put out all the fires, right? The solution is actually to be liberated. Moksha. Real moksha, of course, comes through accessing the soul's capacity for bhakti. Because there's only a very temporary amount, a hard ceiling to the amount of experience of existence, knowledge, and pleasure that's available in material consciousness. And you can twiddle with that. You can adjust it somewhat depending on how you live, right? If you're eating like moss off of the rocks, you can live, but not very well. If you're eating, something else that's more refined, you can live better, but you're still basically dealing with the same functions of the digestive system. You're still basically dealing with birth and death. You don't really escape that shell of your existence. You can just kind of rattle your cage. You can have a better prison cell if you like, but it's still prison. You don't really belong there. And that's what the Bhagavatam is telling us. We've been hearing about this massive fight, and it's relevant not because there was a problem and it was solved. That's happening all the time. In fact, at the cellular level, there are billions and billions of problems happening, and our cells are naturally dealing with them. In fact, every person in this room has had cancer in their life, and their body's naturally dealt with it, because it's a naturally occurring thing. And all these problems are being solved, most of the time, without our knowledge. That's not really news. That doesn't make the pages of Bhagavatam. What made the pages is that it was solved by the Lord. It's actually so amazing the Lord did it. We get to hear about his form. We get to hear about a fight scene between the Lord and a demon. That's really newsworthy. And so the story, the discourse continues, not in terms of, okay, what's the next problem, but how did the spiritually minded persons continue in their uplifting practice of spiritual consciousness, God consciousness, Krishna consciousness, and how did they help others to do the same? That's really relevant for one who's realized it's one problem after another in this world. I don't really belong here trying to fix all these things. It's a game of whack-a-mole that I can never really win. So instead of trying to win that game, I'm going to actually turn to God. And then that hard ceiling on existence and knowledge and pleasure, it's broken. One actually experiences more, understands more, and feels more deeply in the bhakti process than anywhere else. And so this very saintly person, Shaunika, speaking to another saintly person, Sutta Goswami, is asking, okay, how did other people realize what we're realizing? How did this propagation of spiritual consciousness go on after that blip that the Lord actually felt with himself? So we've been hearing about, in my classes I've been talking about communication and principles of communication and the mode of goodness and transcendence, how to communicate effectively, how to communicate in ways that don't create problems. And this, in general, falls under the umbrella of living a sattvic life, living a life with a minimum of problems, living a life that doesn't create more difficulties for you. So, in human life, because the human mind is actually made to contemplate the Supreme, the human mind is actually designed to contemplate the divine and experience it. There's always 2 things going on in material life, life in this world, which is that we're trying to create a comfortable situation for ourselves, which means, as the biologists explain, every living entity is trying to increase their pleasure and decrease their pain. That's always going on. And at the same time, if you're fortunate and you're actually able to apply yourself in spiritual consciousness, you're trying to actually connect yourself to the divine, to transcendental reality. Those two things are always going on. So, being in a better or worse way of eating, a better or worse way of sleeping, a better or worse way of conversing and communicating, that's in the category of managing in this world, which has to happen. Bhaktivinoda Thakur explains that this, what's called in Sanskrit, vyavaharika, this aspect of living in the world, it goes on as long as one has a material body. But one is meant to deal with it as much as they need to, minimize those needs so they actually have more time, more energy, more attention, more heart, more faith, more actual interest in the highest thing, the paramarthika, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says. And that's what the Bhagavatam is dealing with, really. And it's dealing with that by throwing at us all kinds of different situations that, there are adjustments on the vyavaharika, there are adjustments on the material path. Our bodies are going through so many things. Our minds are going through so many things. And the society around us, culture, is going through so many things. I'm like 41 years old now. I remember, so I've reached that age now where I can say when I was a kid, when I was a kid, we didn't have cell phones. When I was a kid, we didn't have the internet. If you wanted to meet somebody, you had to call them at a certain time where you knew they were home. They had to pick up the phone and have a conversation with you on their landline, which was a rotary dial phone, and then you had to meet them. And if you didn't reach them on the phone, too bad, And so that's completely different now. And in 20 more years, it's going to be completely different again, I guarantee you. Guaranteed. Probably more different, because it's just getting more and more accelerated. So all these changes are always happening. The society, culture, language changes, the body changes, the mind changes fastest of all. I mean, yoga text Patanjali describes if you can maintain concentration for like 4 seconds, 9 seconds, you're a hero in terms of, mental power. It's just so restless, the mind, if you can really see what it's doing. So we manage these things, and we do have to a certain degree. Our movement isn't saying neglect everything about material life. It's saying minimize your needs, minimize them. And in general, I would say that in the modern world, we don't really recognize what the minimum of need is. We inflate that. There are a lot of reasons for that. For one thing, if one doesn't realize that there's a spiritual goal to life, then all one really has on their plate for their entire life is how to be more comfortable, how to where should I move, who should I marry, how much money should I make, what should I do with my occupation, and those questions occupy the entirety of one's consciousness. Also, because of market forces dominated by persons who are very much in the mode of staying in the world and enjoying, we're taught to actually maximize our investment in being comfortable. And spiritual culture, Krishna conscious culture is saying, no, understand you can live very happily, very simply. Places like Hawaii actually are evidence of that. One of the most wonderful things about a place like Hawaii is, if you manage yourself properly, you could just sleep under a mango tree, wake up, eat a couple mangoes, and you got 98% of your day for spiritual activity. It's always nice out, that problem is solved. I was born in Tehran. Iran has all kinds of weather. I grew up in Canada, which has this little thing we call winter. So there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to do with clothing, and driving a car is more complicated, and again, you don't have to deal with that here. So it's nice to minimize the problems, but many people don't recognize how simply they can live. I was a monk for 7.5 years. I slept on the floor on a yoga mat with a sleeping bag. I still do actually when I'm in Denver, because I've gotten used to it, and I recognize that it works for me. I mean, everyone's body is different. I'm not saying you should all leave this class and go home and throw your beds out the window and just get a sleeping bag. That's not necessarily what works for everybody, but people don't often even inquire about how simply they can live and be happy, be comfortable, be satisfied. Instead, they're basically taught that they should try to make things more and more complicated, and they're never going to be happy until they, fill in the blank. Until I get that bed, until I get that, pet dog, whatever it is. And so part of spiritual culture is simplifying our lives. Eating a vegetarian diet is simpler. It's much better for one's health, it's better for the environment. It creates a lot less problems. There's a good science on that. And these aspects of spiritual culture, including communication, they're meant to actually help us to not start fires we have to put out later, right? Like I studied public health, which basically is the discipline of how can we as a society prevent problems before they start, which is a really much more efficient way of dealing with things. Otherwise, as my thesis advisor put it, you're mopping the floor while the sink is still running, right? And that's really what material consciousness is. It's like creating so many problems, trying to solve the problems, you haven't even actually stopped the problems from occurring again and again. So living a simple life, including in terms of communication, just creates a less stressful, more simple life with more time, more energy available for the actual pursuit, right? And that actual pursuit is what Bhagavatam's talking about. Who is God? What is my relationship with Him? How can I actually do service in relationship to the Supreme? Who am I, ultimately, beyond the changes of the body and mind? And that's also the goal of the yoga system. We hear that the first 2 limbs of the Ashtanga, 8-limb yoga path, are yama, niyama. Yama means the don'ts. Niyama means the do's. And so we follow the don'ts because it helps us from getting degraded. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't eat corpses. These things cause problems that spiritually minded, wise cultures have recognized. There's a list of things you can do that are just bad ideas. If you avoid them, you save yourself a lot of trouble. Then the niyamas, do's, that helps you get elevated. Do practice spiritual consciousness. Do meditate on your relationship with the divine. Do practice gratitude. Do actually practice the science and art of devotional service to God, ultimately. And so these do's and don'ts are always going on. Managing our materialist situation, trying to be as comfortable as my mind absolutely needs to be, because beyond a certain point, if you're too austere, the mind starts to freak out, you know? And everybody's level of need is different. It's depending on how you were raised, your karma, what family you're born into, what kind of psychological issues and biological issues your human machine has going on, and ultimately where you are in your spiritual practice, because as one practices, the material needs get diminished. And the spiritual need, the spiritual desire increases, which is a very fortunate thing. When you wake up in the morning and you're like, I need to see the Panchatattva. I need to chant Hare Krishna with the devotees. I want to hear what Bhagavatam class is saying today. That is the ingress of real good fortune in your life. So that's what we're trying to do, minimize the material while managing it, not neglecting it. You know, we take care of our bodies, we eat properly and sleep, so forth, and maximizing our spiritual so we can develop a real taste for it. That's real success. Shonika's the evidence of that. He's asking, okay, well, great, that problem was solved, and he's not asking what the next problem was. He's saying, how did the path of bhakti, devotional service, get practiced and get taught more afterwards? So I'll just stop there. We talked about how material life is a constant stream of problems, and solving them isn't the goal, despite the message of the mode of passion, the message of modern advertisements and culture. Solving those problems isn't the goal, because it's not possible, actually. It's not actually possible to solve the material problems, because you gotta die anyway. That's a massive problem. And managing it is relevant and useful, but the real goal of life is to live a simpler life so that one can apply themselves spiritually, and then actually doing that, actually applying oneself spiritually. And if you're really advanced, like Shonika, asking how I can help others to apply themselves spiritually, that's a whole other kind of magnified, intense pleasure. When you're actually completely set spiritually, you help others, that's even beyond that. We talked about how all the management systems of the body and mind and communication and culture and everything else, they're dealing with the constant shifting in this world, and that's necessary, but we're not really investing our heart in that. We know that our real satisfaction will come from chanting Hare Krishna, chanting God's names, hearing about the actually always relevant message of Srimad Bhagawatam. You know, I've been coming to Bhagavatam class for like a dozen years, and it's never gotten old. I've read the Bhagavatam like 3.5 times. It never gets old. It gets better and better. Nothing else is like that. Nothing in material consciousness. So we can take now comments, questions, reflections, beginning with our revered elders. Maharaj, anyone else? Would you like to chime in? Triptosi, you're satisfied? No corrections to offer? Anyone want to reflect back anything that stood out that you'll take away? Yes.
I feel like I'm having a spiritual awakening today. So thank you all for your presence and the gift that you all
You're welcome. Yeah, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, one of our esteemed previous acharyas, he lived like 250 years ago. Amazing devotee in so many ways. He comments on one verse in the first canto that says, Neshtaprayeshu padrishu nityam bhagavat sevaya, that by always serving, the sound vibration of Bhagavatam and the pure devotee, one actually becomes purified and goes to spiritual consciousness, goes back to God. He comments that nityam literally means always, but it also means at least daily. Because for one who has not yet developed the taste to literally always chant God's names, literally always hear the Bhagavatam, like that's what Pariksha Maharaj is doing. He was cursed to die in 7 days. He just literally sits for 7 days and 7 nights, no water, no food, nothing. He doesn't check his iPhone. He's just like hearing the whole time. Until one is like that convinced, at least daily hear the Bhagavatam, chant God's names, take prasadam, see the deity, live in a holy place. These kinds of things, if you can do it daily, just like you brush your teeth daily, it's a really good idea. So he comments that in the practice stage, at least make it a daily practice, and that'll really help it to be solid, consistent, and it'll help the taste to develop. Otherwise, any spiritual experience we have, we can forget by the force of material consciousness. But if you have it every day, it really sticks in the mind and the heart. So thank you for that. More comments? Yes?
What causes a change from the soul wanting to, or the living entity wanting to enjoy the material world and being shown the path of salvation?
So,
what's the segue or the?
Yeah, what's the transition between the committed practice of trying to enjoy the material world and trying to actually apply oneself in spiritual life? Okay, so the material world is designed in such a way, as Prabhupada says in the purport, the Lord is so kind that any soul who wants to enjoy in the material world is given full facility for enjoyment, and at the same time he's shown the path of salvation. The world is actually designed this way. That's the purpose of the world. It's twofold purpose. To facilitate, to allow for, to enable wayward souls to have their experience of being independent from God, even though they're not. They get to pretend they are and have some kind of material enjoyment, and that's what material enjoyment means. Enjoyment in a lack of consciousness of the Supreme. And at the same time, the higher goal is to bring them to the path of actually uplifting themselves back to spiritual consciousness, to pure connection with no motive. And so ultimately what does it is just being in this world for long enough. But the answer is also that we really want to minimize the amount of suffering. We don't want to have to keep running our head into that wall, trying to break it down before we find the door and just move on. And that's what people are doing, unfortunately. They're actually spending a tremendous amount of time finding, well, okay, that didn't work, and this never worked for anyone else, but what if I do this? Then I'll be happy. And the list never ends. One can go on lifetime after lifetime. Ultimately, at some point, I think everybody in this room can attest to this fact, ultimately one becomes frustrated. One recognizes that there's something else that's higher. And the root cause of that, in combination with the fact that material consciousness can never satisfy, because the hard limit on pleasure is always there, and experience is always there in material consciousness. The real root cause of coming to a higher state of realization is the mercy of those who are already at that state of realization. Bhagavatam was spoken by persons in that consciousness. It was translated and distributed by persons in that consciousness. God's names are always being chanted by his devotees in every culture. That's a principle of mercy also. Just like this verse was saying, Shonika was saying, how did the path of liberation get shown to those who will take birth later on? That's us. And everyone like us, taking birth after the Bhagavatam. We're part of that umbrella of mercy. And that's coming from devotees like him who are thinking about us. And if we think about people in that situation, we also become part of that relief program. It's a universal spiritual relief program. And that means distributing prasadam. That means chanting God's names, Hare Krishna. That means distributing transcendental literature and giving our own spiritual association with our own spiritual values. Each drop of that actually shows the conditioned soul an alternative to their futile attempt to try to ram their head against the wall of material life and solve their problems that way, which can never happen. It gives them a real solution. Otherwise, one can be like despondent and frustrated, but that's not really a solution, you know? Intelligent, very intelligent persons often become despondent and frustrated. The smartest philosophers of the modern era they're prone to suicide. The most brilliant comics and comedians are prone to suicide, mental illness, because it's a dark, dark world if you don't see the actual thread of spiritual practice. So just seeing the problems isn't enough. That's enough for one to actually like lose faith in the material activity, but one actually has to have the positive. And the bonus is, if one even hasn't lost faith in their material activity, they're still attached deeply to material activity. Just by hearing about and tasting, literally through prasadam or through the holy name, by tasting spiritual consciousness, spiritual activity, one will lose their taste for material activity. So that's the real root cause of actually, making that shift. Jai Shri Panchatattva Gaurnitai Jagannath Baladev Spadar Ki Jai. Is that okay?
Oh, that's perfect.
Thank you.
Maharaj was mentioning in Nectar Devotion class the other day how Prabhupada emphasized the utilization of time.
Prabhupada mentioned the utilization of time. Avyartha kalatvam. This is one of the symptoms of bhava, a very high level of spiritual consciousness. One doesn't want to waste even a second. They don't want to waste it in lower consciousness. They can feel the difference, and it irks them. So they use their smartphones for reading transcendental literature when they're in line at the grocery store, and they chant Hare Krishna under their breath all the time. And if they're brushing their teeth, they chant in their mind. They listen to kirtan, and they fill all the gaps. It's a very, very practical way. Very practical way to make spiritual advancement. There are actually a ton of gaps in material life. So many gaps. And if you fill them by chanting and hearing and remembering, it's a perfect use of the human body. Thank you. We have 3 more minutes. That's a gap. Anything else that stood out? Reflections, realizations, comments, haikus? Otherwise, we can just fill the gap by moving on to Krishna Prasadam, which is totally fine too. I won't complain. Yes?
I just want to share gratitude for your teachings today and for each person in this room. Share gratitude. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I'm also grateful. It would be less powerful for me if I was speaking to myself. It would be powerful still, but the nature of kirtan is that when it's transformed into sankirtan, when it's cumulative and everyone gets together, either with chanting or glorifying, the philosophy and its application, it gets sweeter. It's more delicious. So thank you for that. Jai. Srimad Bhagawatam ki jai. Samaveta Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Vansha kalpatrupyascha kripasindhuvyeva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo.